Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye podcast. My name is Sean Maloney, and I'm here with my co-host and good friend, Dr. Bruno Fernandez. Bruno, how are you today?
I'm doing good today, Sean. How's it going?
I can't complain. I'd say we have a VIP guest today, and we're happy to introduce him. And I think we're going to dive into quite a few areas that we've never touched on in the podcast before. So with us today, we have Dr. Robert Greenberg, who is the current chairman and CEO of the Alfred Mann Foundation. And he's the former CEO of Second Sight. And Second Sight is probably best known for the Argus 2 retinal implants. And we're going to dive into that a little bit. So Dr. Greenberg, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sean. Good to be here with you and Bruno.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to kick it off with a bit of an unusual question, although I've given you a bit of a heads up in this one. And I was hoping you can comment on Alfred Mann's top 10 list, because I've heard you talk about that elsewhere.
Yeah, so this goes back, and it dates me a little bit. But back when David Letterman used to have a top 10 list on his show, and it was more of a comedy bit, of course. But Al used to have his top 10 list of what makes a great company. Al Mann was a serial entrepreneur, had created many different companies starting back in the 1950s in aerospace, and then moving into medical devices in the 1960s, and really up until his death at 90 years old a few years ago. But his top 10 list of what made a great company started with capital was number one, and then number two was capital, and then number three was capital. So he went on like this for a bit. So I mean, really, the message, the take-home message, was that the essential ingredient, and it seems obvious on one level, that you need capital, but it really is what the only way you can fail is if you run out of money. Was kind of the part of the message. And then the second, once you got down to I think number 5, was people. So, and it was really the capital that enabled you to recruit the people, and it was the people that were going to make the difference. And at the very bottom of the list, the number 10 was the product. And I think the purpose of his top 10 list is that most people, when they think about starting a company, focus on the product as the main objective, as the kind of number one thing. And it's actually in Al's mind was at the bottom of the list, because you could have the best product, but if you have the wrong people or don't have enough capital, it's not going to make it, and vice versa. I mean, you could have a horrible product, but if you have the capital and good people, you can make the product better, and you can make it a success. And then he had a second top 10 list, which was what makes a good product. And on that one, the very bottom of the list was the idea. And so, this is one that he liked to talk about at academic institutions in particular, where it's all about the idea. The idea is actually the bottom of the list for what makes a good product, because, there are things like, what are the cost of goods? Is it manufacturable? Is it reliable? Is it does it really meet the needs of the patient? Anyway, it goes on. There are a million other things. His point there was that the idea is really just the beginning, and the value creation happens along the way in translating that idea from just a concept into something real that can actually benefit patients. And that's really what we do at the Al Mann Foundation now, which is a nonprofit research foundation in Los Angeles. We do that translational work where we take ideas for medical products and make them real to the point where they can be then commercialized by companies and distributed to patients.
And on that path from taking an idea and transforming it into a product that actually has commercial viability, a lot of things can happen. So do you think that there is a lot of intellectual property within universities that is just not going anywhere, like things that could be useful to the society, but for one reason or another are not moving forward?
Yeah, I think there are a ton of great ideas at academic institutions, and really the foundation was founded with that in mind. How do we unlock? You know, Al was interested in unlocking this great talent and knowledge and ideas, and getting them off the blackboard and onto into patients, because I mean most of what Al did throughout his career was medical devices, and that's also what we focus on at the foundation. And it's a hard problem, and there are lots of reasons why it's a hard problem. It's something that that we have special expertise at the foundation to try to overcome these challenges. But there are challenges. You mentioned, Bruno, IP. Often just getting the license from the university can take a long time. One of the initiatives that Al started to try to address that problem is he actually created an institute at USC with the idea of being a mini foundation on campus with a pre-negotiated IP license with the university, so that you wouldn't have that year-long or sometimes 2 years long process of just licensing the IP out of the university before you can even start the project. So he wanted to try to fast track that piece of it, and there's been some projects that have come out of that program. So so there's that challenge. There's the challenge of priorities at a university. Someone who's not yet tenured is not going to be rewarded for patents. They won't be rewarded for licensing technology to a company and commercializing the technology. They're going to be rewarded for papers, and they're going to be rewarded for grant funds coming into the university. And so the incentive system is not set up in most universities, and there are some exceptions. There's some universities that have gotten sort of hip to the idea that they can do more good if they shift those priorities. But so I think there's those challenges too. And fortunately there are some people at universities that do have a focus of wanting to help people and get their ideas and products out there. So it's one of the things we try to do at the foundation is work with those folks and try to help them translate that work into something real.
I think it's, I could have a whole conversation about IP licensing challenges and stuff. And I got to imagine that you might have an easier time having the foundation having the success that it's had, going to these universities and saying, look at the kind of companies that we've built and spun off, with having secured some of this IP versus, if I had starting a company and I wanted to go to the university, knock on their door and their tech transfer office say, hey, I want to license this IP. That might turn into a negotiation that goes nowhere. But
I think that's a fair point. I think both, certainly both our history and the fact that we have capital behind, back to the earlier top 10 list, the fact that we have, the foundation was started with an initial endowment by Al Mann with some shares of Pacesetter stock, was his first medical device company, and the organization's been self-sufficient since 1985. We've created over $7 billion in market cap worth of companies over those years, and through royalties and through equity that we've held in those companies that we've been able to sustain the nonprofit organization with no outside funding. Or minimal outside funding. I mean, we've gotten a few grants over the years and some small donations over the years, but effectively it's been self-sufficient that entire time.
So you've been alluding to that. You're alluding to that first company, and maybe that's a good segue into my next question: is there any lessons learned, I guess, from some of the early successes? I mean, there's been a number of noteworthy successes that the foundation has been behind. Just wondering if there's any learnings that you have taken and then applied to Second Sight. Second Sight's been founded quite a while ago, but I'm wondering if any of those early wins, I guess, helped inform the Second Sight in any way, especially during the development of the Argus 2.
Yeah, no doubt. And it was really a large part of the reason I chose to join the foundation. I mean, I met Al Mann when I was working as a medical officer at the FDA, and he convinced me to come check out what they were doing at the foundation. And it seemed like such a unique set of resources, both the infrastructure and the people that were there. You know, the infrastructure had everything that a medical device company would have, quality, regulatory, manufacturing, clean rooms, but also had things that a university would have, things like a scanning electron microscope and a CT scanner. So, you know, lots of, you know, great toys, which, you know, someone with an engineering background seemed like it was going to be a lot of fun and really productive. But, you know, we founded, Al and I founded Second Sight. I'd been working at the foundation for about a year at that time. And, you know, I think back in grad school at Johns Hopkins, where I did my MD PhD, I had been working on the science behind a retinal prosthesis or an artificial retina, something that would electronically restore vision to blind patients. And it was really just the science behind it that I was able to do at that time. And it did seem like the foundation was a place where we might be able to make it real. And part of the logic there was the foundation had developed a cochlear implant, which was an electronic device that restored hearing to the deaf. And that was really the kind of the original motivation for the Argus and for Second Sight was the success of the cochlear implant in restoring hearing to the deaf. It seemed like we ought to be able to do the same thing for vision. And so we were able to leverage all of the learnings from the cochlear implant days and all of the knowledge at the foundation that had been gained. You know, at that point, it was maybe 20 something years. You know, today it's 40 something years, but at that point, you know, 20 plus years of experience and knowledge in creating implants. You know, probably the most important thing besides the capital and the people was this experience in putting electronics in the body. The body is salt water, so think of an ocean. You know, imagine taking your television and throwing it in the ocean and having it still work. And oh, by the way, we're also going to miniaturize it to the size of a dime, U.S. dime, or you know, or a you know, maybe the size of a large pill. But so pretty tough engineering challenges. But it was the, you know, I think the experience of the foundation in doing that, and, you know, how do you protect electronics? What kind of materials can you use to do that? How do you build something in a reproducible way where you can build more than one of them? So I think a lot of those learnings, you know, when there were, at the time, there were maybe a dozen academic groups, and, you know, I was at Johns Hopkins working on this. There were groups all over the world trying to create a retinal prosthesis at the time. It had become kind of a popular idea. And when we started Second Sight in '98, it was, I think, it was just a few years later, and I guess it was in 2002 when we did our first human subject, and we actually modified a cochlear implant as a way to get into humans quickly. And we learned a ton with those early experiments, where we were able to restore some rudimentary vision with a very crude device that only had 16 electrodes, but it was a way that, you know, it's a way we were able to get to patients. You know, it was years later that we were able to get to patients with the Argus 2, which was our first commercial product. But the having access to the cochlear implant from Advanced Bionics, which was one of the companies that the foundation had spun off, you know, was just a tremendous advantage.
And so, I mean, you mentioned those early days of the retinal implants, like during your graduate studies at Johns Hopkins. Would you like, I'm just curious to know how it was to work with those patients volunteers that were receiving those implants and were able to see for the first time. Would you like to share a little bit about that? Must have been very special.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think for all of our, certainly restoring vision to a blind patient for the first time is yes, probably the most rewarding thing that I've done in my career. But I think anytime that we work with patients and solve a significant medical issue, it's the reason we do this. It's the reason all of us who work at the foundation are motivated to help these patients and their families. You know, the very first time, this was the Argus One, this was the modified cochlear implant I mentioned. The very first time we implanted a patient with that device at Johns Hopkins, we had, so these devices, the idea was that you have a video camera and you wirelessly transmit the signal from the video camera to an implant that's inside the eye, on the back of the eye, called the retina. These are patients with retinitis pigmentosa, and the retina is like a birthday cake or a multi-layer cake, and one of the layers is dead, and we're bypassing that layer by electrically stimulating within a grid of electrodes, so similar to the pixels on your monitor. And so the concept was that maybe we could restore vision this way, and so we implanted a patient with a 4x4 grid. This was the modified cochlear implant. Patient had RP, was completely blind, and we didn't even have a pair of glasses with a video camera yet. All we had was just a handheld video camera. And so the patient was, after the surgery, the patient was able, we let the patient heal for a couple of weeks, and we brought the patient back in, and he was holding this video camera, and we, with a projector, shined the letter L on the wall. And we had probably, you know, people were very interested. It was the first time it had been done. There were maybe 20 people in the room watching. And we asked them, you know, do you see anything? And he starts shaking his head. And you could feel the energy just drop in the room. You know, this had been months, you know, maybe years in planning, actually, to get to this point. And he starts shaking his head. We're like, it didn't work. He doesn't see anything. And then he says, all I see, and he draws in space a line that goes up and down like this, and one that goes to the right. So he drew an L. He said, all I see is,
So he saw.
and we said, what is it? And he said, I don't know, it just looks like an L. And everybody's like, yes. So he didn't, it's like, you know, there was this incredible roller coaster where we went from this, what seemed like a letdown, to elation in the room and cheering. And you know, I'm not sure I don't think I ever went back and asked him, you know, what did you expect to see? And you know, I guess he didn't really know what to expect, but he thought we would show him more than just an L initially. But so anyway, that was the first time that we turned on the Argus One, and really began. That was a really critical moment, because it was at that point that we knew we were onto something. We knew that was kind of the reason for doing the Argus One, was to prove that this could work, and that the concept was valid.
No, and that's you know, that must have been like you said, a highlight, I guess, in your career and in your life. It's certainly just hearing you explain that almost kind of sends shivers down my spine. As a patient with RP, I could maybe somewhat relate to how that would feel. I was hoping to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned the FDA. Can you just maybe give a brief overview of what you were doing at the FDA, and any maybe lessons learned that you then took to the Alfred Mann Foundation?
Yeah, so I was actually working in the general surgery, it was neurology and general surgical division, and I was reviewing applications for medical devices. So it was in one of the medical device, it was part of the medical device departments, and I was a reviewer. I was just kind of a staff reviewer, was looking at, you know, evaluating different applications, and I've learned a ton. I think I might have even ended up there permanently if there wasn't a hiring freeze. I was there on a temporary basis, and when I met Al Mann, and it was one of these situations where the government was on continuing resolution, and so they had a government-wide hiring freeze during that time. But probably I think the thing I learned the most is, I'll never forget the very first day when I joined the FDA. They brought me to my office and showed me my desk, and there was a stack of applications that was probably, I don't know, over 2 feet high. This was when everything was done on paper. And I said, is that, this year's worth of stuff to review? And they said, no, this is this week's reviews. So I think one of the things that I learned was kind of the impossibility of the workload that the people and an appreciation of the workload that the FDA has. And it was impossible to go through. This was maybe, I don't know, 20,000 pages worth of material, and it's just physically impossible to go through it in the level of detail that you'd like to in that short a period of time. And so there's a heavy reliance on the companies to help them and to work with them and to kind of get them the essential information that they need to make the decision in a reasonable time. I think the companies, I would see companies that struggled to get approval, not because their product wasn't good, but because the application took a lot of time to sort of weed through and find the essential information. And so I think by summarizing the important information, with all the backup that if there are questions that they can turn to, allowed us to get products through the FDA process quicker. And I think also recognition. I think working there was a recognition that I think there's often a us versus them mentality where some companies feel like the FDA is there to stop them from making progress, and that was not my experience at the FDA. My experience there was that they are trying to keep people safe, and there is a little bit of a sense that that some companies may be fast and loose, but I think for the most part, I really had a sense of FDA that they were really trying to help get products to market and help ultimately help patients, balanced by this responsibility of keeping patients safe. So it was a great experience, and it's one that I think has certainly helped me as I've kind of gone back on the other side of the equation, and working with the regulatory folks at FDA to get approvals for these products.
Circling back a bit to the retinal implants, Argus, and Second Sight, which I believe was the company created to commercialize those products. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So when exactly was the company created, and what was the main goal when it was founded? Was just to commercialize Argus, or it has a greater mission behind it?
Yeah, so the company, Al Mann and I and a couple other people founded the company in 1998, and I ran the company all the way through the IPO, which happened in 2014. The mission for Second Sight was really to restore vision to blind patients generally. The strategy that I took because of work I had done in graduate school at Johns Hopkins was to initially develop the Argus, which was developed at the company, and first this Argus 1 with a modified cochlear implant to test the idea, and then the Argus 2, the first commercial product that we actually got FDA approval for and got Medicare. to pay for Medicare. This was approved for retinitis pigmentosa, and Medicare was reimbursing $150,000 per implant for the device. So I think great success from a clinical standpoint. Patients were able to do things that completely blind patients were able to do things that obviously were impossible. We're able to get some rudimentary vision back, and then the goal, we always knew that RP was a relatively uncommon disease, and we wanted to ultimately help all blind patients. And so the next step was to modify the Argus implant and to implant it in the visual cortex or in the brain, bypassing the eye, because there were a lot of people that were blinded by accidents or other diseases that damage the retina, and things like diabetes that blind patients and can't benefit from an Argus. So we began working on, right around the time of the IPO, we began working on a direct brain implant, and we implanted the first few of those. Once we kind of implanted the first few of those, and they went well, and that clinical trial was kind of off and running, I decided to come back to the Alfred Mann Foundation, and so I've been back running the Alfred Mann Foundation that we spun out the company originally from, and so that's kind of the short history. Lots of twists and turns along the way, as you can imagine.
I imagine there'll be more twists and turns as the cortical implant develops, and maybe we can touch on. This is just a question I have for my own personal interest. How did the conversations go? Like you mentioned that Medicare or these private insurers were covering up to $150,000 for the cost of these devices, which are obviously enormously expensive, and the whole R&D behind these things is enormously expensive. Yeah. So how did those conversations, like how do you approach that conversation with the insurers and asking them to cover that? And is that something I guess you're going to have to do down the road as well with the cortical implants?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's something the company will have to face. And my involvement today is really just as one of the principal investigators on the clinical trial. I think there were a few keys in getting reimbursement, and we were able to get reimbursement from the European regulators as well as Medicare in the US, and a number of private insurers. And the conversation was not as hard as I mean, it was hard. Some of them were hard and some of them weren't. The most compelling argument, and the thing that ultimately won the day in most cases, was not surprisingly, the functional benefit. The insurers wanted to know, well, what can people do with this device that they couldn't do before? And and that was what really, at the end of the day, what they were willing to pay for. So we started off with clinical tests just in the clinic, showing the level of vision that we were able to restore. But to the FDA's credit, before giving us approval, the FDA also forced us to come up with additional tests that showed a real world benefit. So things like can someone find a cup, a spoon, and knife on the table without having to sort of feel around for it? Can they take out the trash? Can they and so it actually ended up taking us a couple of years more to get the FDA approval. But in those couple of years, we worked with the low vision community to sort of ascertain of what would be meaningful, what would be how could we measure what real world impact the Argus had, and that turned out to be helpful. At the time, we were frustrated that it was going to delay our approvals by a couple of years, but it probably accelerated our ability to get reimbursement by a couple of years. So in the end, I think it ended up saving us time, despite the fact that we were frustrated. In fact, we had applied to get FDA approval. We had the full packet. We had completed the clinical study, we thought. And that was when the FDA threw us this curveball saying, we really want you to develop a real world measure and then test it in patients. And that was, at the moment, that was devastating. That was almost, that could have been a company, had we not had the capital, it could have been a company killing moment, because it was going to take a couple more years to get the FDA approval than we had planned for. But in the end, I think it was, the FDA did us a favor.
You mentioned that like using a cortical implant instead of a retinal implant has some advantages by including more patients into it and not relying on like some preservation of the anatomy of the eye. Can you run us through like the details of it? Because I keep imagining, like you drill a hole through your brain and through your skull, like I'm going to put some wires in your brain, like I mean, don't need to get too graphic, but I wonder if our audience is kind of curious about how that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very similar to the Argus, and in fact, it's in many ways it's a similar surgery in terms of both time and the device itself. So outside, conceptually, it's the same idea. So there's still a pair of glasses that has a video camera that wirelessly transmits to the implant. And now, instead of putting the implant in the eye, we're laying this electrode array that for the Argus and the retina used to just lay on the surface of the retina, which is visually mapped. So, it's mapped just like pixels on your monitor in space. Turns out the brain is also mapped that way, not quite as neatly. And it's something that makes it a little bit more complicated to program the device initially. But it's a similar idea where the implant has two pieces. It has a little, if you think of it's almost like a large button cell battery. So there's sort of this battery that sits in a little cutout in the skull, and then there's the electrode array. There is a small hole in the skull, and this electrode array lays on the surface of the brain, and then things are closed back up, and you can't even tell that someone would have this unless they're wearing special glasses. You can tell from the glasses, but even the glasses, the latest pair of glasses that was just approved, looks like a normal pair of glasses. So you might not even, you probably wouldn't even know unless you knew to look for the camera. It's almost like spy glasses with a hidden camera.
Very interesting.
So it's the surgery takes maybe an hour and a half. It's an outpatient surgery. So far, the patients we have been having them stay overnight, but at some point, I imagine they'll go home the same day, just like the Argus. And the initial Argus patients stayed overnight, and then ultimately it became an outpatient procedure where they went home the same day.
I know we're going to be running short on time here soon, so maybe we could each fire another question at you before we wrap up, if that's all right.
Of course.
I wanted to touch back on the intellectual property because it's an area of interest that I have. I wanted to know if you have any advice for researchers, so academics who think that they might have, intellectual property with commercial potential. Is there any advice that you would have, for these individuals of how would they, go about trying to get that commercialized? Is it worth it, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think the question of is it worth it is a more complicated one, but let me start with just how to go about it. I think most universities have tech transfer offices that can help the professors navigate the process of applying for patents. And I think it's, one of the important things that all those tech transfer offices will say are, see them before you publish or before you talk about your ideas publicly, because that gives them the chance to file patents, particularly internationally. In the US, you have a year after you disclose it, but internationally, you have to file before you disclose it. So So it is important to see that, talk to those offices before you give a presentation that you think might have commercial potential. And I think it is important to file IP. It's it's something. It's a key element of what we do at the foundation. We have well over 300 patents issued, and the patents themselves are not so important, but what they allow is they allow venture capital and others to feel comfortable investing in the idea. And without the IP protection, they could invest the money and bring something to market, and someone could come in right behind them and sort of take the market away from them. So the thing that's been and the reason why we have a full-time at the foundation, we have a full-time IP attorney and a full-time patent agent. We're actually recruiting for a second patent agent right now, if anyone listening happens to be a patent agent. But it's just really important in being able to raise capital. Back to the earlier thing, the patents themselves tend not to be that critical, but it's what they enable. And so I would encourage people, if they are interested in commercializing something, it's very hard to do that without some IP protection. And the tech transfer offices are the best place to learn about how to do that.
So, Dr. Greenberg, I also heard that besides the retinal implants, of course, among other billion things that you're involved on, you mentioned that Alzheimer's disease is something that you would like personally to address. There's no cure right now, even though it's being heavily studied. Do you think that is a solvable problem, and how do you think we could go about that? Like, can we use an implantable device to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's one that I have a personal interest in. I think it's something that is a tremendous problem in our society. We have people living longer who would otherwise be living productive lives that are getting cut short by Alzheimer's, and it's devastating to families that get impacted by it. Whether or not, and there are some people looking at neuromodulation as an example. Can neuromodulation play a role in Alzheimer's? Perhaps. There's some people looking into that. There are other sort of drug type approaches, and I don't know what the answer is today, but it certainly fits into our foundation's mission of a unmet medical need, and something that is having widespread human impact. That if something looks promising, it's something that we would certainly be interested in helping facilitate a solution for. So I certainly don't have the answer to it today, but it's an important problem that we have an interest in. If someone has ideas that may help with Alzheimer's, I think it's one of the most important medical challenges that we have today as a society. And there are lots of them. Obviously, there are many things, many medical issues to focus on, but it's an important one that we haven't really figured out yet.
Well, we hope that ultimately tackling Alzheimer's looks like tackling retinal degeneration and what you do with the Argus 2, and that it boiled down to an engineering problem, ultimately, challenging as it was. Hopefully that's the space we can find ourselves in with Alzheimer's in the years ahead. So Dr. Greenberg, I want to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us in the show today. It's truly a pleasure to speak with you. I know I can speak for both Bruno and I. I think the audience is going to enjoy this episode, hopefully as much as we did. So just want to thank you for joining us today.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you, Sean and Bruno.
Thank you.
Great talking to you.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.